So when was the first military aircraft? Hello, my friends, Takuya here, and welcome back to the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. You know, that question that I asked just now seems like at first that it's going to be a relatively easy one, but then when you go and start to break it down, you kind of realize that there are significantly more complications to that question and then the subsequent answer. Like, as an example, what is an aircraft? And no, hear me out on this. I genuinely am not being facetious here. That is a genuine question when it comes to how we are going to define this. Like, technically speaking, does a kite count as an aircraft? I have to ask that because over the course of history, there were a number of different incidents in which unmanned kites were used in order to spread fire or sounds or other kinds of things in Asia in order to be able to scare people. You'll probably note that at the time I said unmanned because, yes, that is actually a very important distinction that I have to make because a lot of people do not even realize that when I talk about this, that there were manned kites. Obviously, when I talk about that, there are no proper images that I can really pull up to show, but man-carrying kites were things that were apparently used in ancient China. Weirdly enough, for both civil as well as military purposes, which I'm going to need to go ahead and explain that distinction right there. Because on the military side, yes, you could use a kite in order to be able to lift a person up into the air a bit so that you're able to scout and actually recon out like a location. Is that even a word that I'm properly using right there? You can scout, basically. You can scout out a location. But on the civil side, this wasn't something that was done as entertainment. There are records going back to ancient China that specifically say that manned kites were used as a kind of punishment, as an execution. Like apparently the Book of Sui from the 7th century specifically records that one tyrant ruler, an emperor by the name of Gao Yang, would go and execute prisoners by ordering them to fly on bamboo mats, which basically means setting up a bamboo kind of like kite thing, have them be floated off into the air, and then they would subsequently lose control of it and fall to the ground crashing and dying. Fun times. Despite the obvious death that is involved in that, I don't necessarily think that we can count that as combat because execution of your own prisoners does not seem like that should be something that counts as combat. And speaking of accidents, my life. Okay, no, but in all seriousness, I actually have been in a couple accidents here before. I even got ran over by a car while riding my bike in Japan. True story, that did actually happen. And did you know that in 2020 alone, there were over 5 million car crashes, which is more than 15,000 a day and 600 an hour? That's a lot of potential injuries. And if you're injured and you don't know where to start, then with Morgan & Morgan, it is just that easy. Because yeah, if you're lying there prone on the couch, unable to do anything, you can submit a claim and have a lawyer review your case with only 8 clicks on your phone. So remember everyone, if you're ever injured in an accident, you can check out Morgan & Morgan. You can submit a claim in 8 clicks or less without ever having to leave your couch. And for more information, go to forthepeople.com or dial #law. That's #529 from your cell phone, #law. And to be honest, for the purpose of scouting, the overall better option would be developed later when it came to hot air balloons and things like that. Like yes, balloons have been used in war for quite literally hundreds of years, with the first time that they were being used in an actual battle being used by the French back in the 1700s. Specifically, the use was by the French Aerostatic Corps at the Battle of Flers in 1794, and it was there that they would use a tethered balloon called the, I'm gonna butcher the French name, l'entreprenant. Am I saying that right? I might be saying that wrong. I don't know. French people, let me know down in the comment section. But either way, this was a balloon that back at that time was specifically used in order to be able to gain a vantage point over the enemy because, go figure, being able to plan stuff from the sky, like in the case of a Total War game, is significantly better than doing so from the ground. Now, balloons, of course, are always things that had pretty severe disadvantages, such as the fact that they couldn't really fly in bad weather, in fog, if there was any kind of real wind that was there, like, they just wouldn't be very practical. Plus, not to mention the fact that as they were giant balloons, that meant that they were massive targets in the sky, in an age of guns, where people would be shooting at them. And so over the years, many different powers would end up using balloons for reconnaissance. But the honor of who would use balloons first for combat, well, that was something that appears to have been done by the Austrians in Venice in the year 1849. This whole thing happened at a time where the Austrians were besieging Venice in 1849, and they had decided, okay, well, what we're going to do in order to get the city to surrender is that we are going to take 200 paper hot air balloons, and we're going to tie explosives to these things, and we're going to send them out over the city, and hopefully, I guess, after that, what's going to end up happening is they blow up enough targets and the city surrenders. Like, each one of these balloons was equipped with a bomb that was of a size of anywhere between 24 to 30 pounds, which is pretty significant, at least for the time. Now, the whole thing wasn't necessarily very successful, or I say necessarily very successful. I mean, it really was not at all. The balloons were launched mostly from land, but they also did have some that were launched from sea, from different aircraft carriers that would launch these balloons. But what ended up happening is that the wind ended up turning most of this stuff around. One balloon managed to actually get inside the city out of 200. Yeah, balloons were never exactly the most reliable thing to use for combat, and Zeppelin bombers that would be used by the time of World War War I, well, those were, again, massive, expensive targets. So it still wasn't necessarily the best, even if by this point they were actually using Zeppelins as bombers. So that, I guess you could count as the first aerial combat, right? And also, even though I've been talking about this the entire time, weirdly enough, despite what we know that actually happened over the course of history, military bombing balloons and that sort of thing, those were supposed to be banned, or at least to a degree. European powers had actually agreed at the Hague Convention of 1899 to prohibit dropping explosives from, quote, balloons or by other new methods of a similar nature, end quote. The Hague Convention of 1907 would actually end up going further by banning bombardments from, quote, by whatever means on, quote, undefended towns. So, okay, if we're not actually going to be looking at any of these things, then when was the first military aircraft? Well, my friends, one of the contenders for that is this little beauty that you can see behind me right here, the 1909 Wright military flyer, which technically speaking is the world's first military airplane. And I'm going to need to go ahead and explain that here for a second with some background. The short of it is that in the year 1908, the U.S. Army Signal Corps would advertise for bids on a two-seat observation aircraft, and the general requirements that they had at the time were very simple. The aircraft was supposed to be designed to be as easily assembled and disassembled as possible, so that way the Army could use wagons, which it still was heavily using at the time, in order to be able to transport it. Mechanization wasn't exactly very big at this time yet, and trucks were not commonplace, so it would be literally horse-drawn carriages. In addition to that, it needed to fulfill the requirement that it was going to be capable of carrying 2 people with a combined weight of 350 pounds, that it would also have sufficient fuel for a range of 125 miles, and the last detail was that it needed to be able to reach 40 miles per hour in terms of speed while flying in the air. Which really doesn't sound like a lot for an aircraft, but you have to remember that at the time that all this is going down, aircraft are brand new. And that is a big deal for the military to be able to reach such amazing speeds. Yeah, the speed performance was going to be calculated during a 2-lap test flight over a 5-mile course, with one of these points being with the wind and one of those courses being against the wind. The plane also had to demonstrate the ability to remain in the air for at least 1 hour without landing, and then once it actually did land, it would have to be able to land without causing any damage that would then subsequently prevent it from immediately starting another flight. Like, yes, okay, the Army did not want to have a disposable aircraft, basically. That is way too expensive. And listen, America has wasted a lot of money in its history. That was not something that they wanted to do at this time. Another requirement was that it was supposed to be able to ascend in any sort of country in which the Signal Corps might need it in field service, and also, from that, naturally, being able to actually land without requiring a specifically designated and prepared spot. So, of course, you needed to be able to land safely in case there's any kind of accident to the propeller, the machinery, or anything else, so that the whole thing didn't just immediately crash and become one massive, expensive mistake. And of course, as this was going to be a tool for war, and that means cycling through personnel as things may perhaps happen to them, the plane also needed to be simple enough to permit someone to become proficient in its operation within a, quote, reasonable amount of time, whatever that necessarily means for what they would count as reasonable. The purchase price for this aircraft was set initially at $25,000 with an additional 10% bonus per mile per hour that it was capable of going over 40 miles per hour, which sounds like a pretty sweet gig, to be honest, because if you could make something really powerful, you could make some serious bank. But considering the limitations of the day, this was also something that might be difficult to produce, because if it was under 40 miles per hour, then it was going to have 10% deducted per mile per hour that it went under. Now, we're going to be getting into the technical aspects of this plane, so I'm going to be doing my best to actually explain it, but according to the museum, the Smithsonian, where this thing is actually located, the Wright brothers would go on to construct a 2-place wire-braced biplane with a 30 to 40 horsepower Wright vertical 4-cylinder engine driving 2 wooden propellers. This being something that was similar to the aircraft that Wilbur had been demonstrating in Europe in 1908. The airplane would make its first flight at Fort Myer, Virginia on September 3rd, 1908, and several days of very successful and increasingly ambitious flights would follow this. Orville would actually set new duration records day after day, including a 70-minute flight on September 11th, and he also would make 2 flights with a passenger. Now, unfortunately, though, for the Wright brothers, not everything was going to be smooth sailing here, because they were actually going to experience a very severe accident during this time. On September 17th, there would be a tragic accident where the plane, while it was in the middle of flying with a Lieutenant Thomas E. Selfridge, who was the Army's observer, that one of the propellers of the plane, which was made of wood, would break, and this would subsequently cause the plane to crash from 150 feet in the air. Orville was actually severely injured during this crash with a broken hip as well as many other different injuries, but as for Lieutenant Selfridge, he wasn't so lucky and would subsequently die in the crash. Of course, the aircraft was simultaneously destroyed, which was a huge loss, but the real messed up little fun fact from this entire thing is that Lieutenant Selfridge was, technically speaking, the first person to ever actually die in a powered airplane accident. Not only that, but the first ever combat airplane or military aircraft, he would be the first person ever to die in one of those. Which, even though this wasn't combat, I guess you could say from that was the first casualty of war in what would be something that would spawn many, many, many more aircraft to come. Moving on from this event, on June 3rd, 1909, the Wrights would return to Fort Myer with a new machine in order to complete the trials, which had begun in 1908. And the engine for this aircraft was actually the same as what was in the earlier aircraft. But the 1909 model had a smaller wing area and modifications to the rudder and the wire bracing, so it should have been more safe. Lieutenant Frank P. Lom and Lieutenant Benjamin D. Fulloy, who were future Army pilots, were the Wrights' passengers. And on July 27th, with Lom, Orville would go and make a record flight of 1 hour, 12 minutes, and 40 seconds, covering approximately 64 kilometers or 40 miles. This would ultimately satisfy the Army's endurance and passenger carrying requirements, and then to establish the speed of the airplane, a course was set up from Fort Myer to Shooter's Hill in Alexandria, Virginia, a distance of something along the lines of 5 miles. And after waiting several days for the best wind conditions possible, Orville and Fulloy would then make the 10-mile round trip on July 30th. The outlap speed against the wind was 37.7 miles per hour, and the return lap was a much more significant 47.4 miles per hour, which means that combined together, that gave them an average speed of 42.5 miles per hour. And because of this, because they were actually able to go 2 miles per hour over the requirement that was asked, which was 40, this meant that they got an additional 20% bonus, which made an additional $5,000 for a total of a $30,000 purchase. Which, if you adjust that for inflation today, that would be over $1 million, which is, I mean, that's pretty significant for an experimental aircraft that was quite literally just made of wood. Upon taking possession of the military flyer, which was then referred to as Signal Corps No. 1 by the War Department, the Army would then conduct flight training at nearby College Park, Maryland, and at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas in 1910. Being the military, and of course wanting to suit this for different combat needs, various different modifications were made to the military flyer during this period, with the most significant of them being that they added wheels to the landing gear so that it wasn't just skids that would be going along the ground. Fast forward a little bit of time, and then in early 1911, the Signal Corps would then go place an order with the Wrights for the purchase of 2 more of their planes, which were the brand new Model B airplanes. These were things with significant upgrades over the previous 1909 model, and in addition to that, the War Department wanted them to take back the 1909 and remodify it to remove the additions that they had put on and update the old plane with the schematics of the new plane, which technically speaking was possible, and the Wright Company did quote the government a price of $2,000 for the upgrade, but they ultimately advised against it, saying that no, there have been significant improvements in aircraft since then, and there's really no point in trying to update that model from 2 years ago. Which, to be fair, considering what was going on during the world at this time and the rapid development of aircraft, the aircraft that you would see in 1909 versus what you would see going in just like 5-6 years later in 1914 and 15 is a world of difference. And so, trying to figure out exactly what to do with it, the manager of the Wright Company learned that the Smithsonian Institution actually wanted the plane in order to be able to put in their museum, and this is subsequently what would end up happening. The government would donate the aircraft to the museum, and that is where it is to this very day. So if you want to see it, actually right now, like, you literally can go see it. And so yeah, I guess after giving that whole spiel, this was technically speaking the first ever military aircraft, but this was something that was only ever used for reconnaissance, and simultaneously, it's not like the United States was involved in a war during this time where an aircraft could actually be utilized. So I guess depending upon if that is the question that you want answered, the answer that you are going to get is going to be murky depending upon who actually gives it. Because remember, again, we've been talking largely about recon this entire time. So that then beggars the question, when was the actual first use of an aircraft in combat? And who did it? Was it in World War I with their Knights of the Sky? Was it America, the actual inventor of the aircraft itself? Was it Britain? France? Germany, perhaps? No, my friends, it was actually Italy. Which, yeah, okay, that's probably going to surprise a number of you, but hear me out on this. There's a very key reason as to why this is the case. The Italy that we are talking about here is not the Italy that entered the fight with the Entente against the Central Powers in World War I. That wasn't the first use of aircraft in war. Nope, instead Italy has the distinct honor of being the first power to ever use an airplane for something besides recon, and they did so during the Italo-Turkish War of 1911. That being when Italy would go off and face against the Ottoman Empire, which they would, again, subsequently do so a few years later, later in World War I again, but this time it was going to be their fight over Libya, which I will say that is probably something that deserves its own video right there. I know it does. So if that is something that you all would like to see, then by all means, let me know down in the comment section below. But to explain at least a little bit of it so you understand the background of what it is that I am talking about here, the Italo-Turkish War is something that broke out specifically because Italy claimed that basically it was their right as the former Roman Empire to get back their Roman states. Or to be more accurate, Libya was really the only place that wasn't being claimed by other great powers, whereas Egypt had already been taken over by Britain, the other territories from Tunis and going westward had already been taken over by France, and Libya was this isolated little spot that the Italians thought they could nip their own colony, if you will, from the Ottomans, which were very sick by that time. For a while now, Italy had essentially viewed Libya as its own kind of fourth shore, this other territory where poor Italians could effectively be sent over in order to be able to create a new life for themselves. That is potentially something that would solve a lot of the demographic and economic issues that Italy was currently facing at that time. And initially, the Italians tried to do this peacefully, but then the Ottomans, their counter offers were not to Italy's liking. Like, one of the things that they wanted to offer was that Italy could be controlled by the Italians, but it would technically still be a vassal or suzerain of the Ottomans, which was the same kind of relationship that they had with Egypt, where technically Egypt was a vassal of the Ottomans, but it was controlled by the British. And the Italians rejected that, which ultimately would end up leading to a war. But I'm not going to be going into that because, well, you have to let me know in the comment section if you actually want it. The aircraft part, though, I do need to actually talk about here. So the first ever airstrike in history that we're talking about here is something that was performed by an Italian pilot by the name of Giulio Gavoti. So what this guy would do is that on November 1st, 1911, he would go and fly his early model Ettrick Taube monoplane, which is one of the early planes in here that you don't typically think of monoplanes and their use in World War I, because you're usually thinking like biplanes. But he would take this monoplane against the Ottoman military in Libya and proceed to bomb it. How, you may ask, because bombs hadn't exactly been invented for aircraft at that time? Well, what this man did, and I kid you not, is take 4 grenades, each one of which was around 4 pounds and the size of a grapefruit, in a leather pouch, and he went and flew over Ottoman positions, where he proceeded to chuck the grenades out of the plane as he passed in order to bomb the positions below him. He was flying only around an altitude of 600 feet, which was very low, and at the time that he did this, he would screw in the detonators and would just toss the munition over the side of the aircraft. This event would be the first ever recorded airstrike launched from an airplane in history, and it was something that was done in 1911. The really funny detail about this entire thing is that after this and a bunch of other missions that they would also engage in, the Ottoman Empire would issue a protest, because if you remember that thing that we talked about here earlier, the dropping of bombs from balloons is something that should have been outlawed from the Hague Convention of 1899. Like, that straight up should not have been allowed. But the Italians, the Italians went and pulled a little bit of a sneaky by saying, oh, hey, no. This ban does not affect anything that is not a balloon. And of similar devices, this is not a similar device at all. This is a heavier than aircraft. It's not like a dirigible. Dirigible. It's not a Zeppelin, basically. So because this thing was not a balloon, the Italians straight up went, doesn't count. So the whole reason why CAS, why close air support, one of those very valuable tools that would be one of the most crucial aspects of World War II, why that even really came into an existence in the first place here, I guess, is because the Italians said, no, screw you, we found a loophole. And so that, my friends, is the first ever military aircraft. Everyone, thank you very much for watching. This has been Stakuyi with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. This was a very fun little episode to go and create, and I can't wait to do more things like this. So again, if you want to know more things, whatever questions you have, what other things you want answered, please put it down in the comment section below. And of course, I will be putting out polls that will allow me to go and know what it is that you all actually want to see. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye, my friends.